Welcome to Science Reshaped. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us on this incredible journey through the mysteries of the universe. We're about to uncover things that could change everything we know about space. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. For months, astronomers had been waiting, watching as 3I Atlas, a comet like so many before it, made its way toward the sun. Its trajectory was simple, predictable even, a familiar path that seemed to carry no more mystery than any other comet that had come before it. But still, there was something about it, something that didn't quite sit right. Every calculation, every model, all of it told the same story. This was just another comet, just another icy visitor from the distant reaches of space. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to worry about. And yet, as 3I Atlas neared its perihelion, the closest point to the sun in its orbit, something strange happened. The first data arrived. Astronomers stared at their screens, expecting the usual pattern, the familiar curve of light, but instead they saw something else. The light curve was wrong. At first, it was subtle, a slight deviation from what had been predicted. The brightness of the comet flickered, a pulse almost too quick to notice. But it was there, and it wasn't supposed to be. "This doesn't match anything we've seen before," one of the astronomers muttered under his breath. The words hung in the air, thick with tension. The comet's light, it wasn't behaving the way it should. It was too erratic, too uneven. Comets were supposed to shine bright as they drew closer to the sun, their icy surfaces heating up, releasing gas and dust in a dazzling show of light. But this was something else. The comet wasn't just glowing, it was pulsing. The team went over the data again, the numbers, the calculations, the models they had used for years, for decades. Nothing explained this. They double-checked the instruments, the settings, everything. But each new piece of data only confirmed what they already feared. This wasn't the comet they had expected. Something was wrong. What if it's not a comet at all? One scientist dared to ask, but no one answered. The thought was too wild, too impossible. And yet, in the silence that followed, it felt like an unspoken truth. Something wasn't right about 3I Atlas. It wasn't just its light curve that was wrong. It was everything. Something was happening up there, far away in the darkness, and they were missing it. They watched as the comet continued its journey, closer and closer to the sun. Every new data point sent a shiver down their spines. Each measurement revealed more anomalies, temperature shifts, unusual reflectivity. The comet was cooling and heating in a way that made no sense. "How is it doing that?" one astronomer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't expecting an answer, because deep down, she knew there wasn't one. Not yet. This wasn't just a comet. There was something more, something behind the numbers, something behind the light. As the comet got closer, the questions kept coming. The more they observed, the more they realized they were watching something alive. Something that wasn't just reacting to the sun's warmth, but seemed to be controlling its own temperature, adjusting its brightness as if it was making choices. In a world of predictable science, this was a curveball, and not the kind anyone saw coming. Something was out there, watching them, waiting for them to understand. But were they ready for the truth? What were they missing? As 3I Atlas continued its journey toward the sun, the sky held its breath, waiting for the next clue. Something was watching them from the stars, and it was waiting for them to see it. It was as if the universe had decided to speak, but only in whispers. Weeks passed, and the anomaly with 3I Atlas only deepened. The light curve, still puzzling, pulsed with an erratic rhythm. Something was off, but now, something else was happening. Something more immediate, more unsettling. Astronomers had already been tracking the comet from multiple observatories around the world. Each observatory operated independently, but they all reported the same thing: rhythmic flashes in the comet's brightness. It started quietly, just a flicker, a small anomaly in the data. But then, the pulses grew more distinct. They were too precise to be dismissed as a glitch. The data didn't lie. Each pulse arrived at exactly the same interval, like clockwork. The comet's light, which was supposed to be irregular and scattered, was now beating in a pattern, as though the comet itself was breathing. It was hard to explain, harder still to believe. The team at the European Space Agency was the first to raise the alarm. They'd been watching the comet for months, and this was new, unprecedented, a repeating signal, "This isn't natural," one of the lead astronomers said. The words hung in the air, an uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to say aloud. They thought it was an error at first, a miscalculation maybe, but the flashes were so exact, so rhythmic, too regular to be anything other than deliberate. What they were seeing didn't belong to the comet's expected behavior. It was a pulse, a beat in the dark void of space. What if it wasn't the comet itself? What if it was something else? The idea seemed ludicrous at first, a theory no one dared to speak too loudly. But as the data kept coming in, pulse after pulse, perfectly synchronized, it became clear that something was happening that no one had prepared for. Something alive, perhaps. Something trying to communicate. The more they looked, the more it felt like they were witnessing an intelligence far beyond the simple path of a frozen rock. The pattern was undeniable. The flashes from 3I Atlas were too regular to be natural. It wasn't like a comet's usual display of gas and dust reflecting sunlight. This was different. This was too precise, too deliberate. Dr. Elena Torres, one of the lead astronomers in the United States, had spent her career working with strange signals from space, but nothing like this. She stared at her screen, watching the pulses flicker across the data. A feeling stirred deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't had since the days of the first radio signals from space. A feeling of being watched. Could it be a signal? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure who she was asking. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Was it possible? Was it even possible for a comet or something around it to be sending signals? It seemed insane. The thought lingered in the room, echoing louder than any of the pulses. Something was sending a message. The next wave of data was even more unsettling. The pulses weren't just flashing, they were growing. The signal was becoming stronger, clearer, sharper. Each pulse began to carry with it a sense of purpose. A sense of intent. The comet's brightness shifted with each beat, like it was adjusting itself to the rhythm, as if it was aware. It was like witnessing the heartbeat of a living thing. "We need to compare this with other signals," one of the engineers suggested. "Maybe we can find something in the patterns." As the team dug deeper, they realized something even more unnerving. The pulses weren't random. They were following a sequence, one that mirrored the types of patterns scientists had long theorized about when it came to potential extraterrestrial signals. It was, as some began to speculate, as if they had stumbled upon a cosmic message. "What are we looking at here?" another researcher asked, his voice trembling as he reviewed the data. The more they studied the pulses, the more they realized they were out of their depth. No human-made technology could explain this, and yet, the phenomenon was undeniable. It was real. It was happening right in front of them. Scientists across the globe started calling it the pulsing anomaly. They didn't know what it was or who or what was behind it, but they all agreed on one thing. They were not just observing a comet anymore. They were witnessing something much bigger. The pulses came in waves, rhythmic, predictable, like the pulse of a giant heart beating in the vast silence of space. And the closer they looked, the more it felt like it was alive, as if the comet was listening to them, responding to their observations, its light bending and shifting in time with the rhythm of its pulses. It was like a cosmic dance, with each pulse growing stronger and more defined. Every time they thought they understood what was happening, the comet changed again. The signal evolved, and with each evolution came a deeper mystery. "It's almost like, it's alive," Elena whispered, half to herself, as if saying it out loud would make the thought real. But it wasn't just the astronomers who were beginning to feel it. Back on Earth, as news of the pulses spread, something else started to change. The public began to take notice. People from all over the world were watching as astronomers and scientists struggled to make sense of the signals. The pulses were no longer just a scientific curiosity. They were a mystery, and mysteries had a way of drawing people in. The news began to speculate wildly. What if this wasn't just a comet? What if it was something more? What if it was something intelligent? Could it be a message from another civilization? A probe sent from the stars? A warning? A call for help? Each new theory seemed more outlandish than the last, but each new piece of data pushed them closer to the truth. 3. Atlas wasn't what they thought it was. The comet wasn't alone. Something was with it, and it was waiting. As the pulses continued, the scientists felt a growing sense of dread mixed with awe. This wasn't just a comet. This wasn't just a rock in space. This was something else. something alive, something far beyond their understanding. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of space, the questions grew louder. Why was it pulsing? What was it trying to say? And most haunting of all, what was watching them from the dark? It was like watching a flame burn in reverse. The comet, 3I Atlas, was not following the rules. The data told them one thing, but the comet's behavior told a different story. And this time, it wasn't just about light, it was about temperature. And the temperature was wrong. Astronomers had always known that as comets approached the sun, they would heat up. The ice and gas trapped within them would vaporize, creating the iconic tale of dust and debris. It was a predictable process, a simple equation of space physics. Comet gets closer to the sun. It heats up. It glows. That was the way it had always been, until now. When the first thermal readings from 3I Atlas came in, they were met with confusion. The comet's surface temperature was not only inconsistent, it was behaving like nothing they'd ever seen before. Instead of steadily rising as the comet neared the sun, the temperature fluctuated wildly. It was like the object was actively controlling its own heat, cooling down when it should have been heating up, and then suddenly rising when it should have been at its lowest. A delicate balance, and one that shouldn't have been possible for a simple chunk of ice and dust. The readings were so erratic that the scientists thought something was wrong with their equipment. But as more data rolled in from other observatories, it became clear this wasn't a glitch. Something was happening with the comet itself. Dr. Elena Thompson, a thermal physicist at NASA, was the first to realize the implications. She spent hours analyzing the data, trying to understand the temperature shifts. It's like it's regulating itself, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she even believed the words as they left her mouth. A comet regulating its own temperature. It sounded insane, but the numbers didn't lie. The fluctuations were too controlled, too deliberate. It wasn't just reacting to the sun. It was almost as if the comet was deciding when to heat up, when to cool down, and when to stay in between. A perfectly timed dance between heat and cold, as if the comet were alive. Elena looked at the screen, where the data was laid out before her like a map, and felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She zoomed in on the sharp spikes of heat. There it was, that sudden and mysterious rise in temperature, perfectly aligned with the exact moment that the comet's pulsing light had increased. A connection, a pattern. The comet's heat wasn't just fluctuating randomly. It was reacting to something. The more she looked, the more it felt like the comet had become a machine, its temperature a signal, an intentional signal. The comet was doing something, but what? And why? In the months leading up to this, the scientific community had assumed 3I Atlas was just another icy object from the Oort cloud, a wandering traveler passing through our solar system. It was supposed to follow a predictable path, doing little more than casting its brief frozen glow across our skies. But this was something else, something that seemed alive. The fluctuation in temperature wasn't the only strange thing. The comet also emitted bursts of infrared radiation, more than it should have. It was as if the comet was absorbing energy and releasing it in unpredictable bursts. What was it absorbing? What could make a comet behave this way? And then it hit her. What if this wasn't just a comet? What if it wasn't natural at all? Could 3I Atlas be some kind of engineered object, a machine sent from somewhere beyond? The idea seemed impossible, but what if? Elena wasn't alone in her thoughts. Across the globe, other scientists were beginning to ask the same question. In Europe, Dr. Hans Weber, an astrophysicist with the European Space Agency, looked at the same data and had the same realization. He sat in front of his computer, staring at the screen, his hands hovering over the keyboard. The comet was alive in a way that didn't make sense. They were still watching the comet's strange temperature patterns, still collecting data, still trying to understand what was happening when something even stranger occurred. The comet, or whatever it was, sent out another pulse, but this time, it wasn't a simple flash of light. It was something more. Something. focused. Astronomers began to notice the bursts of radiation coming from 3I Atlas had a strange pattern to them. Each burst seemed to coincide with the comet's closest approach to the sun, as if it were gathering and storing energy from the star. But how was it storing that energy? And why was it releasing it in such a structured way? As the comet neared perihelion, the pattern became even more distinct. Every time the comet's temperature spiked, the pulses would intensify, almost like a feedback loop. The heat and the pulses seemed connected, each one feeding off the other, as if the comet was feeding off the sun, absorbing energy and then releasing it. The idea that 3I Atlas could be a natural object, simply reacting to its environment, was fading fast. And in its place was a darker, more unsettling thought. What if this comet wasn't just a frozen rock at all? What if it was something much more complex? A machine, a probe, an artificial object sent to observe and gather information? No one could say for sure, but one thing was clear. Something was deeply wrong about 3I Atlas. And as it continued its path toward the sun, every new piece of data only deepened the mystery. It wasn't just heating up. It wasn't just pulsing. It was alive in a way no one could explain. And that thought was enough to send a chill down the spine of even the most seasoned astronomers. Every new piece of information felt like another piece of a puzzle that, so far, had no answer. 3I Atlas was something different. It was more than just a comet. It was something they couldn't fully understand, something that wasn't supposed to exist, and the questions kept piling up. What was it doing? Why was it behaving like this? And more than anything, what was it trying to tell them? Each pulse, each burst of heat, each new discovery only made the mystery grow. And the deeper they went, the more it seemed like the comet was leading them somewhere. But where? And what would they find when they finally got there? The answers seemed just out of reach. And yet the comet's strange behavior, its inexplicable heat, its sudden bursts of light, hinted at something much larger, something waiting to be discovered. And what they were about to uncover might change everything they thought they knew about space and about the universe itself. The comet's journey was far from over. And as the days went by, one question loomed over everything else. What was 3I Atlas hiding? There's a moment in every mystery when the pieces finally begin to fall into place, when the chaos of data and confusion starts to make sense, even if just for a second. But with 3I Atlas, that moment never quite came. Instead, what unfolded before the scientists was something far more unsettling, a pattern. At first, it was just a flicker, a subtle trace in the light curve. The comet wasn't behaving like any comet they'd studied before, but in the absence of any other explanation, the team had tried to ignore the growing unease. They attributed the strange pulses to some unknown cosmic anomaly, something no one could have predicted. But as the days passed, the pattern didn't go away. It grew, slowly, imperceptibly at first, like the rise of an unknown tide. Every data point began to line up, and as they analyzed the information, they saw something that couldn't be ignored. Each pulse, each shift in temperature, each spike in brightness, they were happening at exactly the same intervals. Like clockwork, the comet wasn't just emitting light or heat. It was doing so on a predictable schedule, as if it were following a blueprint. The realization hit hard. They weren't just observing random, chaotic behavior. No, this was deliberate. This wasn't a comet. It was something engineered, a machine perhaps, and it was showing them something they hadn't seen before. Dr. Alina Torres, who had been the first to suggest that 3I Atlas might not be a simple comet, felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the data. The pulses weren't just random fluctuations in brightness. They were rhythmic, each one aligned perfectly with the comet's movement around the sun. It was almost as if the object was reacting to its environment in real time, like a living thing, or better yet, like an intelligent being. It's like it's watching us, Alina said. more to herself than anyone else. But the words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Watching them. Who was watching? Across the globe, teams of astronomers and scientists were studying the same data, and they were all drawing the same conclusion. This wasn't a comet. This wasn't some random object flung from the outer edges of the solar system. It was something else entirely. At NASA, Dr. Elena Thompson sat at her desk, her mind racing as she analyzed the now familiar data. The temperature fluctuations, the pulses, the precise intervals. They were starting to resemble a type of communication. It was too perfect to be anything but deliberate. Whatever 3I Atlas was, it was responding to something. But what? Elena ran simulations, trying to find a way to explain the comet's behavior using the physics they knew. But every time she thought she had a handle on it, another piece of data would appear, and the entire theory would crumble. It was like chasing shadows. Then she noticed something in the pattern, a small, almost unnoticeable shift in the comet's trajectory. It wasn't much, just a slight curve, a change in speed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The comet wasn't just reacting to the sun, it was moving with purpose. "What is it doing?" Elena muttered under her breath. She had seen objects in space change course before, gravitational slingshots, impacts, even the occasional flare of radiation. But this wasn't natural. This wasn't normal. As the comet drew closer to its perihelion, the signals became clearer. The temperature spikes were no longer just random. They were synchronized to the comet's path, each pulse timed perfectly with its orbit around the sun. The entire object seemed to be aware of its surroundings. It was almost as if 3I Atlas was following a set of instructions, reacting not to the sun's radiation, but to a set of unknown signals. At this point, the word machine was being tossed around more frequently than anyone was comfortable with, but it was becoming harder to deny. Whatever 3I Atlas was, it was far more than a comet. It was something engineered, something that was actively interacting with its environment. And then came the breakthrough. Dr. Hans Weber from the European Space Agency was the first to suggest what no one else had dared to say out loud. "What if it's a probe?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's not just a comet at all? What if it's something sent here to observe us?" The room fell silent. The thought was terrifying. A probe? From another civilization? A machine designed to observe humanity? It was the stuff of science fiction. And yet, as the data continued to pour in, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. The pulses, the temperature fluctuations, the precise movements. It all pointed to something more than a natural object. It pointed to an intelligent presence. What if it's not just studying the sun? Elena mused. What if it's studying us, monitoring us, waiting for the right moment? The idea echoed through the team, gaining traction with each passing hour. They were no longer studying a comet. They were studying a machine, a sophisticated piece of technology that had been sent to our solar system, for reasons none of them could yet understand. The realization sent a shiver down everyone's spine. What was 3I Atlas doing here? Why had it arrived now, at this exact moment? The comet had been traveling for thousands, maybe millions of years, and yet it had arrived at a time when humanity was beginning to look beyond its own world, when we were becoming more aware of our place in the universe. It felt almost like the comet had been waiting for this moment, waiting for humanity to reach out, to understand its presence. And just as quickly as the idea of 3I Atlas being a machine had taken hold, another thought began to settle in. If it was a machine, what was it looking for? What was it trying to tell them? What message was it sending? If it was sending one at all? The answers felt just out of reach, like a book with the last few pages torn out. And every time they thought they were getting closer, another puzzle piece would fall into place, and they would be left with even more questions than before. The comet had gone from an intriguing anomaly to a cosmic mystery. And the closer they got to solving it, the more it seemed like the mystery was just beginning. What were they seeing, really? What was the comet trying to say? And more importantly, who or what was behind it all? The answers weren't clear yet, but one thing was undeniable. 3 Atlas wasn't just a comet. It was something far more complex, far more purposeful than anyone had ever imagined. And with every passing day, the pattern became clearer. Something was watching them. Something was waiting. And they had no idea what it wanted. There are moments in history when the impossible becomes undeniable. And for the scientists tracking 3I Atlas, that moment had arrived. The comet had already defied everything they thought they knew about celestial bodies. It had pulsed with light. It had fluctuated in temperature in a way no natural object ever should. But now, as the comet approached its closest point to the Sun, the moment of Perihelion, it did something even more shocking. It moved. Not just in the way that any object would naturally move in the Sun's gravitational pull, but in a controlled, deliberate fashion. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But as the days passed, the data became irrefutable. The trajectory of 3I Atlas was changing ever so slightly. It was no longer following the predictable arc of a comet racing toward the Sun. Instead, it was adjusting its path, almost as if it were maneuvering through space. Scientists had seen objects in space change their trajectories before. The gravitational pull of the Sun, the influence of nearby planets, all could affect the course of a comet or asteroid. But this wasn't random. This wasn't the result of natural forces. This was something far more deliberate. A precise shift in course, as though the comet was actively avoiding the Sun, bending around it, dodging it. And it did this with a calculated grace that no natural object could ever possess. Dr. Elena Thompson was the first to bring it up during a meeting at NASA. She had been watching the data with mounting disbelief, her fingers trembling as she zoomed in on the comet's trajectory. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It's changing its course, Elena said, her voice almost inaudible, as though the words themselves were too radical to speak. It's not just reacting to the Sun's gravity, it's adjusting on its own. The room went silent. Her colleagues stared at the data, unable to immediately grasp the implications of what she was suggesting. Was it possible? Could a comet, a natural object, have the ability to make such a precise, calculated maneuver? But as the data continued to flood in, the answer became clear. 3I Atlas wasn't just a comet. It was a machine, a probe, something that could actively control its movements. The more the team studied it, the more it became clear that the comet was behaving in ways they could not explain. It was almost as if it had a purpose, a mission. It wasn't just passing through the solar system. It was navigating it, following a course that seemed to avoid any collision with the Sun, deflecting the natural forces around it. A singularity in motion, bent on its path, undeterred by the cosmic forces that would normally alter the path of any comet. The implications were staggering. What if 3I Atlas wasn't a comet at all? What if it was some kind of probe designed to study the Sun, or perhaps humanity itself? Dr. Elena Torres, the scientist who had first suggested the comet might not be natural, now found herself more convinced than ever. "This is no ordinary comet," she said, her voice tense with excitement. "What we're seeing is engineered. This thing is far more advanced than we are. It's using technology that can control its trajectory with pinpoint precision." But still, the question remained. Why? Why would anyone, or anything, send such a machine to our solar system? What was its purpose? What was it meant to observe? And who, or what, was behind it? The idea that 3I Atlas could be a probe, sent by an advanced civilization, seemed less like science fiction and more like an unsettling possibility. As the comet neared the Sun, it became increasingly clear that its behavior was not random. It was too calculated, too deliberate. This wasn't the work of a natural object. It was the work of something intelligent, and that intelligence was watching them. As 3I Atlas reached its perihelion, it performed yet another strange maneuver. The comet's light, which had been pulsing steadily for weeks, suddenly flared. A massive burst of energy shot from the comet's core, sending out a wave of radiation that spiked on every observatory's instruments. The flare was so powerful that it shook the sensors, registering as an anomaly on a scale never before seen in cometary data. The team was stunned. It was as if the comet had reacted to something, as if it were answering a question, or perhaps sending a signal to the universe, or to them. "It's not just observing," Dr. Hans Weber said, his voice filled with awe. "It's communicating." The thought was unsettling. Could this comet be trying to send a message? If so, to whom and why? The team raced to analyze the data, hoping to uncover some kind of pattern in the burst of radiation. The frequency, the wavelength, everything about it seemed deliberate, almost as if it were a coded message, but no one could decipher it. It was like trying to understand a language they had never heard before, one that was alien to everything they knew. As the comet reached its closest point to the sun, the pulses seemed to reach a climax. The intensity of the radiation, the light curves, the temperature shifts, all of it intensified as if the comet was absorbing energy from the sun and channeling it back into space. But why? What could it possibly be doing with all that energy? It was at that moment that Dr. Elena Thompson had a chilling thought. "What if the comet is feeding?" she asked. "What if it's collecting energy not for its own benefit, but for something else, something beyond our comprehension?" The more the team thought about it, the more that possibility seemed terrifyingly plausible. If 3I Atlas wasn't just a comet, but a machine, a probe, then what if it had been sent to gather data, to study the sun, to study humanity, to gather resources for something far beyond what they could imagine? The comet's movements, its energy bursts, its rhythmic pulses, all of it suggested a purpose. But what was that purpose? Was it gathering information? Was it an advanced surveillance system? Or was it something more sinister, something that was watching and waiting for the right moment to act? For all the data they had collected, there were still no answers. But one thing was certain. 3. Atlas was not just a visitor. It was something far more complicated. And the closer they looked, the more it seemed like the comet was leading them somewhere. Somewhere they weren't sure they wanted to go. As the comet continued its path, closer and closer to the heart of the solar system, it seemed to grow more alive, more aware, and with each new discovery, the question only deepened. What was it waiting for? And more importantly, what was it preparing to do next? There are some moments in the pursuit of knowledge when the universe seems to stop, as if holding its breath, waiting for us to see what it has been showing us all along. The comet 3I Atlas was now more than just a curiosity, more than just a comet behaving in ways that defied explanation. The pulse, the temperature shifts, the deliberate trajectory, they had all been unsettling signs. But now, something new was emerging, something darker. In the weeks following the comet's perihelion, as its light dimmed and its path became steadier, the astronomers began to notice something that couldn't be explained by natural processes. They weren't just observing 3I Atlas anymore. It was as though something was watching them. It started with a quiet anomaly in the data, a faint signal. At first, no one thought much of it. The comet's pulses had been erratic before, so this was just another fluctuation. But as the data continued to pour in, the signal grew, not louder, but more distinct, more defined. It wasn't just a spike in radiation. It was something far more peculiar, something that didn't belong to 3I Atlas at all. The signal was coming from a region of space just behind the comet, faint at first, but unmistakable in its repetition. "I don't think this is a coincidence," said Dr. Alina Torres, her voice tinged with unease as she examined the data. "The signal isn't coming from the comet. It's coming from somewhere else." The idea was absurd. How could something be sending a signal from behind the comet, and why hadn't they detected it earlier? The comet itself was still behaving strangely, its pulses, its sudden bursts of light. But this new signal seemed entirely separate. It wasn't coming from 3I Atlas, but from a region that was in its direct path. A faint, patterned signal, just out of their reach, as if lurking in the shadows, waiting. And then came the moment that would change everything. As the team continued to monitor the comet, they realized that the signal wasn't just some random burst of radiation. No, this was too specific, too mathematical. It was structured, almost like a code. Each pulse was separated by an exact interval. The signals grew in intensity, just as the comet approached its perihelion. It was as if whatever was sending the signal was aware of the comet's movements. "That's not possible," Dr. Elena Thompson said, her face pale as she stared at the readings. "This signal, it's timed. It's not just random noise. Someone, or something, is behind it." The data was clear. There was intelligence in the signal. Something was out there, waiting, watching them, and sending them a message. "Who would be sending this signal?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But no one had an answer. No one wanted to voice the truth that was beginning to gnaw at them. What if the signal wasn't from a natural source? What if it was from another civilization? Something far older and far more advanced than humanity could even imagine. As days passed, the signal didn't fade. It grew. As 3I Atlas neared its closest point to the sun, the signal's intensity peaked. The pulses, like the comet's temperature fluctuations, seemed synchronized, almost like a system, a machine. But what was it? Why now? As they analyzed the signal, a pattern began to emerge. The pulses weren't random. They were rhythmic, structured, a repeating sequence that resembled a language, but one that no human had ever encountered before. Was it a code? A message? The thought was terrifying. If this was some form of communication, it wasn't from anywhere in our solar system. The signal had no known origin, no known source. It was coming from behind the comet, from somewhere deep in space, and it was growing stronger. "No," Alina said as she combed through the data. "It's not just a signal, it's communication, a message. It's deliberate." The idea was horrifying. Was this some sort of interstellar probe left behind by an ancient civilization? Or worse, was it a form of surveillance? Had 3I Atlas been sent as some kind of message to humanity? A warning? A test? A signal that we had never been prepared to understand? They couldn't ignore the implications any longer. This was no longer just about a comet. This was something far bigger, far darker. The thought that the signal might be a message from another intelligence sent chills down their spines. And yet, the more they analyzed the data, the more they were forced to confront a terrifying possibility. The signal, the comet, the pulses, it was all connected. And whatever had sent the message wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Hans Weber from the European Space Agency had a theory that he hesitated to share. But as the data mounted, he could no longer keep it to himself. "What if we're not the first ones to notice this?" he said, his voice filled with dread. What if we're not the first ones to be watched by whatever sent this signal?" The words hung in the air. What if humanity was the subject of an experiment? What if we were being observed, monitored by something far beyond our understanding? Something ancient, something cold and calculating, waiting for humanity to reach a point where it could finally reveal itself. The questions hung heavy in the room. Why had it come? Why had it been waiting for so long? And then, as though the universe itself was pulling back the curtain just a little bit further, another disturbing realization occurred. In the data, the team began to see something, a shift in the way the signal was behaving. It was no longer just a passive observation. No, the signal had begun to change, to respond to the astronomers' actions. It was as though it was aware of the team's growing understanding. It was as if whatever was sending the signal knew they were listening, and it was reacting. The team was no longer sure what they were dealing with. At first, it seemed like a simple mystery, a comet behaving in strange ways, sending pulses of light and heat. interacting with the sun in a manner they couldn't explain. But as they continued to dig deeper, the mystery grew darker. The comet wasn't just a comet. It wasn't just a cosmic anomaly. It was a messenger. And the signal, that was no coincidence. It was an invitation, a challenge, a warning. The implications were chilling. The comet had not just been traveling through space. It had been gathering information, watching them, the bursts of radiation, the temperature shifts, the pulse. They weren't random. They were tests. And if the comet was a probe, its true mission had yet to reveal itself. What if the signal was not an invitation to learn, but an invitation to join something? A cosmic test, a check of humanity's readiness. But to what end? And who or what was behind it? The questions were mounting, and with every new pulse from 3I Atlas, with every new anomaly, the truth seemed to slip further out of their grasp. But one thing had become clear. Whatever was behind this, it was watching them, observing them, and it was waiting. The universe has always been a place of mystery. But every now and then, something so strange occurs that it forces us to confront the terrifying thought: are we alone in the vastness of space, or are we being watched by something far beyond our understanding? The comet 3I Atlas had already shattered every assumption astronomers held about what was possible, and now, as they delved deeper into the strange signal that had been growing behind the comet, a darker truth began to unfold, one that no one could have anticipated. The signal had become more than just a strange anomaly. It was no longer a faint, irregular pulse, easy to dismiss as cosmic background noise. It had evolved into something far more defined, something deliberate. As 3I Atlas continued its journey through the solar system, the signal began to change, taking on an almost rhythmic pattern that no natural source could explain. Every burst, every pulse seemed to follow a precise interval, one that matched the comet's movement in space. But it wasn't just timing the comet's path. It was interacting with it. Every time 3I Atlas neared the sun, the signal would grow more intense, as though something was responding to the comet's presence. But who or what was sending this signal? And more importantly, why? Dr. Alina Thompson had been the first to recognize the unmistakable structure in the signal, something that set it apart from the usual cosmic radiation. It was too organized, too intentional. It wasn't random noise. It was a message, a code. "You're not going to believe this," Elena muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. "The signal, it's changing, it's evolving." The team gathered around her, eyes wide as they watched the patterns shift and evolve. What they had initially thought was a cosmic fluke, a freak event, was now unmistakably a methodical, calculated communication. The pattern of pulses didn't just match the comet's trajectory, it seemed to be interacting with it, responding to its movements, its position in space. It was as though the signal itself had been tailored specifically to the comet's passage, to its interaction with the sun. "What if it's not just observing?" Alina Torres asked, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "What if it's communicating with the comet? But why? And who, or what, is behind it?" The question hung in the air, a question that no one could easily answer. The idea of extraterrestrial intelligence had always been a distant thought, a science fiction fantasy. But now, as they stared at the data unfolding before them, it felt less like fiction and more like an undeniable reality. Something, someone, was out there, and they were watching. The signal had a rhythm to it now, almost like a heartbeat. It grew stronger and weaker in synchronicity with the comet's pulses, as if they were part of a larger system, a mechanism working in tandem. It wasn't just that the comet was a carrier of the signal. No, the comet seemed to be the center of something much larger, something far more profound. "What if the comet is meant to send this signal?" Hans Weber suggested, his voice quiet but filled with a sense of dread. "What if it's a probe, a relay, carrying a message from somewhere else?" The thought was terrifying. A probe, a signal from another civilization. The implications were staggering. The data they had so far was damning, but the questions only multiplied with each passing day. They had assumed that 3I Atlas was just a comet, a natural phenomenon with a peculiar orbit. But this new signal, this was something else, something far beyond their understanding. The more they analyzed the signal, the more the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just a message, it was a communication system, a complex, layered system of coded bursts, a language they couldn't yet decipher. And with each new pulse, it became clear the signal wasn't just being sent, it was waiting for a response. "Look at this," Eleanor said, pointing to the data on her screen. "The frequency is changing. It's like a conversation. It's listening." That was when the dread truly set in. The signal wasn't just a one-way transmission. It was as if whatever was sending it was waiting for them to answer. It was a call, a beckoning, a challenge. They were no longer just observing an anomaly in space. They were participants in something far larger, something that was happening whether they were ready for it or not. 3I Atlas wasn't just a comet. It was a messenger, a bridge between them and something that had been hidden for millennia. A civilization, a network, a probe sent by a far-off race to test humanity's readiness. Elena's mind raced. The comet had already altered its path, maneuvered in ways that seemed too precise to be natural. The signal was growing stronger. The data was undeniable. The comet wasn't just carrying a message, it was waiting for a response. And the longer they stared at the data, the more they realized that whatever was out there, whoever was out there, was not going to stop until they had an answer. Hans Weber's voice cut through the tension in the room. What if? What if it's been watching us? What if the signal is a test? A test? Alina's voice was shaky. A test for what? For us? For humanity? I don't know, Hans replied, his voice barely audible. But the timing, the pattern, it's too precise to be anything else. What if 3I Atlas was sent here for a reason? To see how we react, to test us? The thought was horrifying. What if the comet wasn't just observing the sun? What if it was watching humanity, watching Earth, waiting for something? A signal, a response. What was it waiting for? And more disturbingly, what if the signal was an invitation? An invitation to something far beyond the reaches of the solar system. The idea of a test, of being watched by something so advanced and so far removed from humanity was almost too much to bear. The scientists, the astronomers, they were no longer just scientists. They were the subjects of an experiment. The human race was under scrutiny, a part of a larger cosmic game, one they hadn't even known they were playing. And the most unsettling question of all, what if they failed the test? Days turned into weeks, and the signal didn't stop. It only grew louder, more pronounced. It was as if the universe was stretching its fingers out to them, beckoning them to respond. Every signal, every pulse, seemed to demand an answer. But what kind of answer could they give? How could they respond to something so alien, so beyond their comprehension? The signal from 3I Atlas had become the most important question humanity had ever faced. What was it? Who was it? And what did they want? And then, as if the universe had been waiting for them to come to this conclusion, another pulse rang through the data. Stronger, clearer, more urgent. It was as if something, or someone, was reaching out once more. This time, they couldn't ignore it. It was too direct, too intentional. They had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Whatever was out there, it was listening. It was waiting. But waiting for what? And now, the question wasn't just about the signal. It was about humanity itself. The comet, the signal, the pulses, they were all part of something much larger. Something that had been unfolding in front of them for millennia, and now humanity had finally stumbled upon it. The signal wasn't just a warning, it was a door. And whether humanity was ready or not, it was about to be opened. The truth was dawning on them. With every passing day, the reality became harder to deny. 3. Atlas was not just a comet. It was a probe, a machine, and it had been sent to our solar system for a reason. But the question that haunted the scientists wasn't about the comet's behavior anymore. No, the question had shifted. Now the question was, where did it come from? The signal that had been growing stronger, the pulses that seemed to time, themselves in perfect synchronization with the comet's path, had stopped being an anomaly. It was no longer a mystery. It was an invitation, a message, a probe from somewhere far beyond the stars. But where? Where was it coming from? And more importantly, who had sent it? Dr. Elena Thompson sat at her desk, staring at the data that had consumed her thoughts for the past few weeks. The pulses, the temperature shifts, the deliberate trajectory, all of it pointed to one chilling conclusion. 3. Atlas was a probe, an artificial object engineered with a purpose, and that purpose was to observe, to gather data, and perhaps to communicate. But the origin of the probe remained a question that none of them could answer. "We're missing something," Elena said quietly, her voice filled with frustration. "There's something in the data we haven't seen yet. A clue, a hint of where this probe could have come from." The team had spent countless hours combing through the signal, trying to decipher its meaning. They had identified the structure in the bursts, a rhythm, a code of sorts, that was too intentional to be anything other than a form of communication. But what were they being told? What was the message beneath the pattern? And who had sent it? Alina Torres, still shaken by the implications of their findings, had spent the last few days reviewing the trajectory of the comet. Its movements were too precise, too controlled to be a random comet passing through the solar system. It wasn't just responding to the sun's gravitational pull. It was reacting, moving purposefully, with intention. If we assume it's a probe, then we have to ask, who made it? Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Who could have created something so advanced, so far beyond what we understand about technology? The question hung in the air, heavy with its implications. The team had been operating under the assumption that 3I Atlas was a natural comet, but now everything had changed. The data didn't lie. This wasn't just a comet, it was a machine, a sophisticated piece of technology sent from somewhere far beyond the solar system. The most unsettling part of it all was that the probe seemed to be waiting. It wasn't just studying the sun. It wasn't just gathering information. No, it was waiting for a response. The signal had been growing, intensifying, almost like it was testing them, like it was seeing if humanity was capable of understanding its message. But why? And who had sent it? What if this isn't just about us? Dr. Hans Weber suggested, his voice tense. What if this probe was sent to test more than just humanity? What if it's been sent to test life itself? To test how life in this part of the universe reacts to contact with something beyond its understanding? Hans's theory, though unsettling, made a certain kind of sense. 3I Atlas wasn't just observing the sun. It had been positioned in such a way that it was perfectly aligned with the solar system's path, and the timing of its arrival was too perfect to be a coincidence. The universe, it seemed, was setting the stage for something monumental. The comet's path, its behavior, its signal. They were all pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that had been waiting for humanity to uncover its secrets. The idea that 3I Atlas was not just observing but testing life itself sent a chill down everyone's spine. Were they truly ready to face the consequences of this discovery? What did it mean if they weren't the first civilization to encounter a probe like this? What if they were just one of many? And if they failed the test, what would happen? There's only one way to find out, Elena said, determination in her voice. We have to learn as much as we can. We have to respond to the signal. It's the only way forward. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. They had spent so much time observing 3I Atlas, studying its light, its heat, its pulses. But now, the situation had changed. They weren't just passive observers anymore. The signal had reached them, and it was clear that whoever, or whatever, had sent it was waiting for a response. As the days passed, the The scientists worked feverishly to decode the signal. They had already recognized its rhythmic pattern, its intervals, its bursts. But now they had to go further. They had to find the meaning behind the message. What was it trying to tell them? What was it asking of them? And what would happen if they failed to respond? Dr. Elena Torres spent hours running simulations, testing various responses to the signal. The more they experimented, the more they realized that the signal wasn't just about numbers or data. It was a communication of some kind, an interaction. It wasn't just about receiving information. It was about participating in the exchange. They had to answer, to engage with whatever had sent the probe. And as the signal grew stronger, they realized something even more unsettling. The probe, the comet, wasn't just sending a message to Earth. It was sending it to everyone. They weren't the only ones who had been contacted. The signal was broad, reaching out into the stars. It was a message designed for anyone who was ready to listen. Elena paced around the room, trying to make sense of it all. The signal wasn't just a message from a distant civilization. It was a challenge, a call to those who were willing to listen and respond. But the question remained, who was it calling to? Was it a test, a greeting, or something far more sinister? The thought that they were not the first, that they were just one of many civilizations to receive this message, filled Elena with a sense of dread. What if there were others out there in the vastness of space who had already responded? What if humanity was too late? What if they were being watched, judged by a higher intelligence, and there was no way to turn back? Perhaps this is the beginning of something bigger, Elena said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Perhaps this is the moment that humanity steps into the larger universe. The idea was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The thought that 3i Atlas was just the first of many probes, each one carrying a message from a distant civilization, was almost too much to comprehend. But the truth was undeniable. Humanity was not alone. Whether they were ready for it or not, they were now part of something much bigger. The signal, the comet, the mysterious machine, all of it pointed to one thing. This was just the beginning. Whatever had sent 3i Atlas was watching, waiting, and it would not stop until humanity responded. The only question now was, what would they say? As the comet continued its slow journey through the solar system, the team watched, waited, and prepared. The universe had just shown them a glimpse of something far greater than they could have imagined. And now, the time had come to make a choice. The signal wasn't just a question, it was a call to action, and humanity's response would determine everything. The months had passed, but the haunting truth of the signal was still fresh in the minds of those who had been part of the discovery. 3i Atlas, the comet that had first been dismissed as just another passing object, had become the focal point of humanity's first encounter with something far greater than themselves. The comet's behavior had been extraordinary. Its pulse, its temperature shifts, its deliberate trajectory, but nothing had prepared them for what happened next. The signal from behind the comet, the one that had seemed to pulse in perfect rhythm with its path, began to change once again. It wasn't just evolving this time, it was intensifying. What had started as a faint, almost imperceptible hum in the depths of space had now become an overwhelming presence, a presence that reached into their very souls, beckoning them to understand, to respond. It was no longer just an anomaly. It was now a force of nature, like the sun itself, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. Dr. Elena Thompson could feel it in her bones. The comet was no longer the only thing transmitting the message. The signal had grown, stretched outward, and now it felt like it was coming from all around them. The vastness of space, once so cold and indifferent, now seemed alive, as if every star, every planet, every piece of cosmic dust was part of a vast, interconnected web that they had just begun to understand. And yet there was still so much they didn't know, so much that still eluded them. "I don't know how much longer we can hold off," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with both fear and awe. The team had been studying the signal for months, attempting to decode its meaning. But each time they thought they were getting closer, the signal would shift again, its meaning slipping further out of reach. The last set of pulses, the ones they had observed in the weeks following the comet's perihelion, had been unlike any before. They were not just stronger, but more intricate, more deliberate. They had found patterns within the bursts, but these were patterns that seemed to shift as soon as they were discovered. It was almost as if the sender of the signal, whoever or whatever it was watching them, monitoring their progress, and it was adapting. "I don't think this is just a message anymore," Dr. Hans Weber said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's an awakening. It's like the comet is waking up, like it's becoming more aware of us. More aware of itself. Elena turned to Hans, her mind racing. What did he mean by awakening? The comet had always seemed alive in a way they couldn't explain. But this was something else, something far more unsettling. If 3i Atlas was a probe, it had been designed to observe, to gather data. But now, it was as if it had entered a new phase of its mission, one that was not just about collecting information, but about interaction. And it was waiting. Waiting for what? Was it waiting for humanity to respond? Or was it waiting for something else? Had they missed something along the way? The signal continued to grow. Pulses became more defined, more intense. Every burst was now accompanied by a strange, haunting feeling. An undeniable sensation that they weren't just receiving a message. They were being watched. It was as though something was studying them, evaluating their every move. What if we're not just part of this experiment? Alina Torres asked, her voice trembling. What if we're the test? What if everything we've done, everything we've observed, has been part of a larger trial? A test to see how humanity responds when faced with the unknown. The question sent a chill down everyone's spine. They had always assumed that they were the ones in control, that they were the ones observing the comet. But now, it was becoming clearer that they were the ones being observed. The sender of the signal was not just waiting for a response. It was testing them. It could be preparing us for something, Elena said slowly, her mind working through the implications. Maybe it's not just about the signal itself. Maybe the signal is a way of preparing us for what comes next. But what comes next? Hans asked, his voice a mix of fear and curiosity. If this is a test, if we're being watched, then what happens when the test is over? What happens if we fail? Elena shook her head, the thought too terrifying to entertain. We can't fail. We won't fail. But even as she said it, Elena couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had taken root in her mind. The signal, the comet, the pulses, they had all been leading to something that was now just out of reach. And the closer they got to understanding the message, the more it seemed like the universe itself was pushing them towards something they weren't prepared for. As the days passed, the team continued their work, analyzing the ever-evolving signal, trying to decipher its meaning. The bursts of radiation and light had grown even more structured, almost like an intricate dance of information, one that was still beyond their comprehension. They had theories, but none of them seemed to fit the scope of what they were witnessing. Every new discovery only added more layers to the mystery. They were getting closer to the truth, but the truth seemed like it would tear their understanding of the universe apart. Then, something happened. A massive pulse, the largest they had ever seen, erupted from the comet. And this time, it wasn't just a burst of energy. It was a wave, a shockwave that rippled through the data, sending a jolt of energy across the solar system. The shockwave was not just felt by the observatories on Earth. It was felt by every probe, every satellite, every piece of technology they had sent into space. It was as if the entire solar system had been affected by it. The signal had changed once again. This time, it wasn't just the timing that had shifted. The structure of the message was different. It was more personal, more direct. The team scrambled to decode it, their hearts pounding as they worked through the data. They realized that this pulse, this wave, wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a call that had been sent across the stars, a call that was now directed at humanity. What does it want? Alina asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. What is it asking of us? Elena stood there, staring at the data, her mind reeling. The signal wasn't just growing. It was evolving, becoming something more. The probe 3i Atlas wasn't just observing anymore. It had become an active participant in the communication, almost as if it had awakened to a new purpose. We have to respond, Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. We have no choice. This isn't just about science anymore. This is about our future. This is about the next step in human evolution. But as the team worked to prepare their response, a chilling thought crept into Elena's mind. What if they weren't just responding to a signal? What if they were being drawn into something much larger, something that humanity wasn't prepared to face? What if the awakening wasn't just the probe coming to life? What if it was the universe itself, calling humanity to account for something far beyond their comprehension? The signal had evolved from a simple message to a call to action, and the question was no longer if humanity would respond. It was how. As 3i Atlas continued its silent journey across the solar system, the team was left with no answers, only more questions. They had been given a glimpse of something greater, a cosmic message that would change everything. The only thing left to do was to answer, but the truth lingered in the air like an electric charge. What had they just discovered? And more importantly, what was waiting for them on the other side of that response? The universe was watching, waiting, and the time to act had come. The days were becoming more surreal. The signal that had once been a faint, puzzling noise was now a constant presence, looming over every thought, every action. The more the team learned about the nature of the signal, the more they felt it pulling them into its orbit, like the comet itself. 3I Atlas, which had once been nothing more than a distant, icy wanderer in the vastness of space, was now the center of their entire reality. And the more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a comet. It wasn't even a natural object. 3I Atlas was something much more than anyone had ever imagined. It was a machine, a probe, an artificial construct sent by an intelligence so far beyond humanity's understanding that even their wildest speculations seemed to fall short. For months, the team had speculated about the comet's true nature. They had entertained ideas ranging from a simple natural anomaly to a more outlandish theory that it was a visitor from another star system. But now it was no longer a theory. It was a certainty. The temperature fluctuations, the deliberate course adjustments, the signal, the bursts of energy, all of it was too precise, too intentional. This was not a comet following a natural path. This was something else entirely. Dr. Elena Torres sat in the dimly lit control room, staring at the latest set of data. The signal had changed once again. It was no longer just about bursts of energy or rhythmic pulses. It was becoming too structured, too sophisticated. It was like trying to decode an ancient message. But each time they thought they were close to understanding, the signal would shift, taking them further away from any definitive answer. But one thing was certain: the probe, the machine, was alive. It was active, it was aware, and it had been waiting for humanity to reach this point. As the team worked to decipher the final pieces of the signal, Elena Thompson stood at the window, gazing out into the night sky. The comet was still out there, silently moving through space, its true purpose just beyond their reach. But the truth had already begun to settle in. The more they studied the data, the more they realized that the comet was not simply gathering information. It was part of a much larger, more complex system. It was connected to something, and whatever that something was, it was watching them. "It's a machine," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just a probe. It's something designed to watch, to collect, to act." Hans Weber turned to her, his eyes wide. "But who built it? Who would send something like this to our solar system? And why?" Elena shook her head, unable to answer. For months, they had been asking that very question, but every answer only led to more uncertainty. The signal was becoming more elaborate, more intricate. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was a dialogue, a communication system that seemed to be interacting with them, adjusting to their responses, adapting to their questions. It was as if the probe itself was learning, evolving. "I keep thinking about the timing," Elena said, her voice shaky. "Why now? Why when humanity is reaching out to the stars? When we're preparing to explore the farthest reaches of space? Why send this probe now, when we're on the edge of discovering so much more?" The questions echoed through the room, unanswered. The team had spent months analyzing the data, testing their hypotheses. But every new discovery felt like a door opening to a much bigger mystery, one that they weren't sure they were ready to face. But there was one thing they couldn't deny. The machine was here. It was among them. And it had been watching humanity for far longer than they realized. They were no longer the first ones to observe 3I Atlas. They were the subject of an experiment, a test of humanity's readiness. And what if this machine, this probe, wasn't just a passive observer? What if it was an intervention, a test not of humanity's technology, not of its scientific knowledge, but of its character? What would humanity do when faced with the unknown? Would they rise to the occasion, or would they fail? Would they be able to respond to the message, to understand the meaning behind the signal, and ultimately, to face the consequences of their actions? The answers were elusive, but the truth was becoming undeniable. The probe wasn't just a machine. It was a message, and that message wasn't just for humanity. It was for all life in the universe. The comet, the signal, the bursts of energy. They were all part of a cosmic conversation that stretched far beyond Earth. In the silence of the control room, the weight of that realization settled in. The universe was vast and the human race was small. But what if they weren't the first civilization to encounter this machine? What if they were just one in a long line of species who had encountered the same test, the same probe? And what would happen when they answered? "We need to respond," Elena said, her voice breaking the silence. The words were simple, but they carried with them the gravity of their situation. "We've come this far, we've watched, we've observed, but now we have to act. We can't ignore this anymore." Hans nodded slowly. "But how? What do we say to something that's been watching us for so long? What do we even know about it?" Elena turned to face the others, her expression grim. "We don't know everything, but we know enough. We know that 3i Atlas is a machine, a probe. We know it's part of something much bigger. And we know that it's waiting for us to respond." Elena's voice cracked as she spoke. What if it's too late? What if we're not meant to respond? What if it's already too late for humanity?" The thought was a knife to the heart. The idea that they might not be prepared for what was coming, that humanity might fail this test, was almost too much to bear. But Elena refused to accept that. They couldn't give up. "Not now. We have to respond," she said firmly, her voice steady. "We don't have all the answers, but we have to try. This is our moment. This is our chance to show that humanity is ready for what comes next." As the team worked together to prepare their response, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the precipice of something monumental. The signal was a doorway, and their response would determine whether they stepped through it or turned away. But stepping through it would mean confronting something far bigger than anything they had ever imagined. It would mean answering a call that had been sent from the farthest reaches of the universe. And whatever was on the other side of that door, whatever awaited them, it was coming. Soon, the machine among them, the probe in their sky, wasn't just a visitor. It was the beginning of something far larger, something that would change the course of human history forever. The question was no longer whether humanity could answer the call. It was whether humanity could survive the answer. And soon, they would have no choice but to find out.